So this week we'll be doing a ink and watercolor painting of a butterfly on a little flower. So when I start off the drawing of my butterfly, I want to think about how butterflies are symmetrical. And I don't want to get too detailed too fast. So I'm actually going to start off my drawing with just getting kind of the angle of my butterfly. So a lot of times I'll use my pencil and hold it up to a line to try and figure out what angle it's going to be at. So I'm going to draw this really dark, but you probably want to draw it lighter because then it's easier to erase. So I just have this line for kind of like the middle and where the body of the butterfly is going to be. And then I'll normally put a very light line for the top of the wings, and then another line for kind of where the first range of wings end. So see how these are two wings, these are two wings. So I just put a kind of a line, just an estimation of where that's going to be. And then a line for the bottom of my butterfly. And then if you're doing this the exact same size as your photo, a lot of times you can use a ruler or you can use your fingers to measure how big that's going to be, or you can kind of eyeball it. So, and then next I'm going to start off with just very lightly drawing kind of a big oval and then a small oval for my body. And then I'm going to start kind of planning out my wings. So, and again, this isn't going to be super detailed at this point, because if I get too in love with all of my little details, then it'll be hard to erase. So always be willing to erase, start over to a point. And then this line kind of helps me to keep my wings about the same size. So, and this is just kind of a loose idea of how my butterfly is going to be shaped. And then from there, I would start, kind of refining my details, looking at how, the wings need to be lined up a little bit more. I'm not erasing my lines because a lot of times if you erase your lines as you're making corrections, then you kind of forget where the wrong line was. So sometimes I'll correct it and then I'll come back in and erase it. So I kind of know where it needs to go. And then once you have the overall shape done, then I would start splitting up, the wings into the pattern. And obviously it depends on what kind of butterfly photo you're doing. There's not really a specific pattern you have to do for your butterflies. You really just want to try and look and see what your photo looks like. So, and butterfly wings tend to be symmetrical, but really make sure you're paying attention to your photo, because that doesn't mean they're exactly the same. And I'm just lightly putting these shapes out to kind of give me an idea of where those shapes need to go. And then I'll start coming in and shaping my, lines a little bit better. And I would put in the spots. And then when you're shaping its head is kind of round. And then it gets a little chubby here, and then it gets a little bit smaller. And its body actually ends a little bit shorter than its wings. And then after I kind of had a general idea of where my butterfly is going to go, then I want to figure out my flower. So the flower, I would just kind of very lightly draw out a circle just to figure out how big it needs to be, and then start coming in and separating it by little petals. So that's how I kind of start that. And then I won't waste your time following this entirely. I already finished the drawing ahead of time and transferred it to my watercolor paper. And you can transfer your drawings a lot of times with 6B pencil, transfer paper, if you're doing ink on top of it. If you're not going to do ink on top of it and you don't want a lot of pencil lines, I would do 6B on the back because it comes out a lot lighter. So now that I have my drawing on here, I'm going to go ahead and get my ink pen, which is just a micron. I'm using size 03, but other sizes work perfectly well. It's kind of your preference. I like 03 because it's kind of right in the middle where it's not too small, not too big. And then I'm just going to go ahead and start outlining my butterfly. Now that I have my butterfly outlined, I'm going to go ahead and take my eraser and start erasing some of the little pencil lines that I don't need anymore. So I'm just using kind of a pencil-shaped eraser. You can also use a kneaded eraser if there's not a lot of lines, or you just need to lighten lines. This one's good for really kind of small, direct areas. Or if there's a ton of lines, you can always use one of the bigger erasers. But you don't want to use this when your watercolor is wet, or, if your watercolor paper is, warping a little bit, because it will tear off a layer of the watercolor paper. That's why kneaded erasers are sometimes better. So now that I have that all done, what I'm going to go ahead and do is kind of put in some of the little details on his body, or her body, we don't know. So I'm just going to draw kind of some small curved lines at the base, and then I'm going to do a little bit of shading on the top of the body just by doing some hatching. And then once I get to these lines, I'm just going to do a little bit of hatching in between to kind of create some white lines. So I'm kind of leaving a little bit of white showing on there. Have a little bit of contrast. So that kind of gives it nice texture. And I can also go back in and make the top part a little bit darker than the sides. And then for all of this area, you could do all of that in ink, or you could do that in black watercolor. I'm going to do a little bit of design lines on my flower petals. And I'm really paying attention on my reference, how each of these petals is curving. So you don't want to just copy and paste and do your shading exactly on the same on all of them, just because they all have a little bit of a different kind of curve to them. So like these nice shadows are going in this direction, but these are more going straight. And I really want to be careful that I keep this kind of little highlight that's at the top of the petal, just by doing a little more shading right underneath that highlight. And this one over here, I would do a little bit of shading. And less is more, so don't feel like you have to fill the whole entire thing with shading. Sometimes just having a few little lines to hint at shading is just enough. Right, and then I'm actually going to go ahead and start on the watercolor rather than filling all of this with ink. Again, that's kind of up to you. I like to do sometimes the watercolor first, because then I can tidy up my edges using some of the black. So I'm going to start off with some yellow. Let me just move that. I'm going to be using some cadmium yellow, which is a nice warm yellow. So in your colors, you typically have a warm and a cool color. So this is my cadmium yellow, so it's nice and warm. It kind of makes you think more about the sun. And then I have lemon yellow, which is a cooler yellow. So it tends to look like it has a little more, it's a little more vibrant, but also it's almost a little greener. So I'm going to use some of my cadmium yellow because I want my butterfly to feel very warm. And then I'm going to take a tiny bit of my orange, or if you don't have orange, you can use a tiny bit of cadmium red, because again, it's a warm red. And I'm going to do a very light wash of this color on all these little areas on my wings. You know, and even though I'm going to be covering up these with black, I'm still kind of avoiding those areas just to keep my painting tidy. And there's a little bit of light orange over here. When I'm filling these areas, in order to not have a lot of brush strokes, I'm using the body of my brush and just doing a few little strokes. I'm not touching them very much. I'm just doing a flat wash and then leaving them. Great. So now that I have that, I'm going to go ahead and take some more orange. And the areas that are right near, you know, kind of the body of my butterfly, I'm going to drop in a little bit of darker orange. And then I'm going to take a little bit of a wet brush, not sopping wet, and I'm just kind of dragging that orange to my other orange. And if it spreads too much, you can always lift it with your paintbrush. And then I think I need a little more paint. And the ones up top are actually a little bit darker than the ones at the bottom. So later on we're going to add another layer to the ones up top. And to make these a little bit brighter at the tips, I'm just going to drop in some cadmium yellow, and all of this is going to mix. So in order to make them not mix very much, you want to wait for them to dry a little bit more. And then I'm going to mix a little bit of red into my orange and go over some of these on the very edge. And if you notice that a lot of your colors are turning really pale really soon, sometimes it can be if you're using too much water. Like if I was trying to get a darker color, but it was like really, really pale, that means it's too wet. So you want to make sure if you're trying to get a nice saturated color that you don't use a lot of water. Mix your intended color and then add a little bit of water to it instead of starting off with a lot of water. So it's almost like tie-dye. And I'm going to add a little bit orange at the base of these while they're a little bit wet. And then while that's drying, I'm going to take some of my alizarin crimson, which is kind of a pinky red, and I'm going to do a really light wash all over my flower while this is drying, because that flower is kind of pink. And I'm adding a little bit of yellow to it because I think it'd be interesting to have some of them be a little peachy. So, and that's just kind of my first layer. And then I'm actually going to come in, again, while this is drying. In watercolor, you kind of have to jump all around. I'm going to take some cerulean blue. I'm going to go over the body of my butterfly. Because if you look at the butterfly, it's not just flat black, you know, some of its body actually has little reflections of blue, even purple in some areas. So I'm going to put some blue at the front of the body. And I'm going to put a little purple at the back of the body. Very lightly though. And then now I'm going to take some alizarin crimson. I'm going to add a little bit of my cadmium red to it, or you could add a little bit of yellow because I'm trying to make kind of an orangey red. And then in the very middle of our flower, we have kind of that center area where the butterfly gets all of its pollen. So I'm painting around some of my petals with this really kind of dark red. Looks like it ends about there. And then I'm going to take some Payne's gray, or, you know, to make it more interesting, you could just use purple. Payne's gray is a really nice, cool gray. And I actually might add a little purple to my Payne's gray to make kind of an interesting color. And then I'm going to drop that in while this is still wet. Helps to add variety, to have some light and dark. And then I can also come in with salt. So this is margarita salt. It's kind of a great salt to use for watercolor because it has really nice chunks. And I'm just going to kind of sprinkle a little bit in the center. And you want to make sure you do this while it's wet, because if you wait and try and do this later, when it's dry, it's not going to do anything. So we'll have to wait for that to dry. So, and then we'll go ahead and block in very lightly our background. So, you know, if you had more time, you could always put this to the side and wait and do the background at the very end. But I'm going to go ahead and work on my background. So for my background, I really like all the very fun greens that are back here. So I'm going to be taking some sap green. And I really want to make sure before I start on my background, I have my colors all set out, all nice and mixed. Because with backgrounds, you do have to work them in sections, and also you have to make sure you do them consecutively, or else it'll just, you know, you'll get spots that are dry, spots that are wet. So you want to make sure you're prepared and have all your colors set up ahead of time. So I'm mixing a yellowy green by adding some more cadmium yellow to my sap green. And then I'm going to actually have a cooler green too. So I have Viridian, but you can also mix sap green with some ultramarine blue or phthalo blue if you want it even darker. So now I have a nice mix of greens. So what I'm going to do is take some clean water, and I'm just going to wet the section I want to work on. I'm making sure to go around my petals. And I'm actually wetting my paper a little bit farther than I'm going to do color, because that really helps not to run into the issue of your background drying before you work on to the next session. Okay, and I'm going to start taking some dark green. And I'm just kind of dropping it in down here. And I might even take some purple, because purple and green make a very interesting mix. And since my background, my butterfly has such light colors, it's good to make your background darker sometimes to make it show up. But since it has such black outlines around it, it's sometimes also good to have some light areas mixed in. So you don't want to have it just one or the other. And then to add texture to my background, I could add a little bit of salt, just really small amounts. Because if you go overboard with salt, sometimes it'll suck up all your paint. Doing a little more green. And I like having a little bit of white showing in there, so sometimes I'll just take a little water and I'll spread that color a little bit and leave some little white spots. Makes it a little interesting. I'm going to take some purple. And yellow and purple are complementary, so I have to be careful when I'm going in between these two colors to have a little bit of green to help separate them. I mean, green and purple don't make the greatest of color, but it's better than what yellow and purple do, because that goes straight into brown. So in order to lessen how much brush strokes you have in your painting, again, you want to try and use the body of your brush. And then I'm going to throw in a little more purple. Or if you want it to seem like there's far away pink flowers, you could put some pink in your background. And one thing is, don't get distracted and leave a lot of hard lines. So you have to kind of do your background fast, but you don't want to freak out or, overreact to it. You want to make sure you're paying attention, but you don't react too fast. Because if I freaked out and was like, oh no, I need to fix this, that would take off too much. So you want to very calmly touch up an area that maybe needs more green. All will be well. So I really like kind of having some fun texture in my background because it kind of makes the background seem like it's farther away, but still makes it interesting. And then I'm going to kind of go back in with some of my darker pinks and start adding some shadows onto my petals. Since, mostly it's going to be in the inner area, the outer area is going to be really wet, so I don't really want to touch that. So I'm just coming in and doing a layer of dark on some of my really dark inner petals, leaving a little bit of that lighter pink showing. And this is a little bit of a complicated flower, so you could always do a different flower for this picture, because butterflies go on a lot of flowers. And then to kind of make some interesting highlights in my petals, I could take my paintbrush and lift some little highlights, or even a small flat brush is fantastic. I can get it out of my paintbrushes. It's fantastic for lifting some small highlights, as long as it's nice and firm. And then I'll come back in and do some dark lines. For some texture. Then we will just continue doing some more little shadows. Now you don't want them to be all flat red. So as you go out, some of the petals start to change in color. So I can make some of them a little orangey, or just adding a little bit of yellow even on top of that red makes it a little bit interesting. And a really important thing is making sure that any that are overlapping each other, looking for those shadows. Like this right now, they all just look the same. So I want to make sure, you know, I have some shadows in between them or at the very base of them. And then now I'm actually going to go ahead and start working on the black area of the butterfly. So instead of jumping straight to black, I'm actually going to use some Payne's gray. And I can add a little bit of Van Dyke brown to my Payne's gray, and it makes kind of a nice darkish gray. And I'm going to come in and just start blocking in and going around my orange, because your orange should be dry. And butterflies actually have little white spots on them, so you want to make sure you're going around those. You can even make new little white spots just by, you know, leaving a little bit of the paper showing. You can leave it a little loose. You know, you don't have to be super specific if you want it, you know, to be a little more interesting. Because that's why paintings sometimes are more interesting than photos. Just because as artists, we kind of take a little leeway and loosen it up a little bit. And if you accidentally go over some of your white spots, you can always come back in with like a white pen. Like this is a Jelly Roll white pen, which is really great for putting back in little white spots. Which, you know, if it happens, it happens. No need to get worked up over it. So, and then if it goes into some of your orange, you can always take a slightly wet brush and try and lift some of it off. You know, don't want to go crazy and spend my whole day going over it, but a little bit doesn't hurt. And then when I'm trying to outline something in watercolor, I want to make sure I don't just outline it and then fill it in. A lot of times I'll kind of outline a section and make sure I have enough time to fill it in. Because in watercolor, a lot of times if you outline something and it dries, it's going to leave a hard line. So, and then to add a little variety to my painting, I could always go over it with that dark color one more time in some areas. Or if you want a really, you know, flat, high contrast look, you could always, you know, try and make all of your grays really consistent just by, you know, keeping a really big puddle of that color and testing it to make sure it's that same kind of gray. there you go. And then I could always go over that more and more, you know, be a little more refined, and I'll probably go back in with some more ink, but that's how you can start your butterfly.